Okay, we will move to the next item on our agenda, which is 1B, and we have a presentation from the Austin Police Department on their general orders relating to Resolution 95. So this has kind of been an ongoing discussion we had. We sent a letter to City Council asking to be a part of this review, and so now we're having both APD and the Office of Police Oversight present their recommendations, and so we're gonna go ahead and listen to that. So it looks like they're pulling the presentation up here.
Well, good evening, commissioners. I appreciate y'all giving us an opportunity to give you an update on where we're at with some of these policies. And I don't know who's driving this slideshow, but in a moment, if I'll get you to advance your slides, what we're going to do is go over 6 specific policies that the City Council addressed in a previous resolution and how we are addressing those with our proposed policy changes. And this will be your opportunity, obviously, to provide us with feedback. My understanding, and I believe the OPO can speak to this as well and maybe clarify some of it, but the purpose of this presentation is for you to understand how we're looking to move forward with policy changes. I believe the OPO is going to give you their recommendation on what those policy changes should look like. And then obviously the expectation would be for you to provide whatever feedback you may have regarding these policies. So if I can ask that we move to the first slide. And what you'll see here is the first policy. I don't intend to read to y'all tonight, but I'll kind of summarize this and give y'all a moment to read the responses. But the first one is the policy about prohibiting chokeholds. And this is found in APD General Order 200.3. And what you will see is that our policy would and does actually prohibit the neck restraints. We have not actually trained on neck restraints since we've been in the department, and as you are well aware, that's 30 years. And so our policy, as you can see here, would prohibit those unless it was a deadly force situation. And in deadly force situations, officers are not prohibited from using anything and everything at their disposal, given what they may be facing at that moment. So again, this talks about the chokehold being prevented, talks about direct and indirect pressure by any means, protecting the throat, the windpipe, the airway, and again, with the intent to prevent, reduce, or hinder blood flow. So this is how we will address this in policy. And I would just reinforce that this is something that as a department, we have had in place as far as this was not an approved technique for decades. I know it's some departments are addressing this for the first time. For us, we will just be more formally addressing some of this as a policy issue. The second policy that came up was regarding, it was specifically addressing military equipment. As you can see on the left-hand side in that first column, what council was addressing was the use, stockpile, and purchase of military equipment shall be reduced to the greatest extent possible. And we shall not purchase or accept military equipment without city approval. And then it talks about the inventory. And for those of you that may not be familiar, that what you see there, the 1033 program, the LISO program, law enforcement agencies have the ability to obtain military surplus through the LISO program. So you have to apply and be approved to be a member of that program. And then we have the ability to make requests as the military releases equipment that they have in surplus. So the way that works is we have members of our department that have gone through specialized training. They understand how the system works, how the requests to acquire this type of equipment have to flow through the system. And then they're the ones that would make those requests. These are very time-sensitive requests in that oftentimes when more sought-after equipment shows up on the surplus program, it is immediately requisitioned by all those agencies that are paying attention. We do have LISO equipment in the police department right now. We went through a rather lengthy process roughly a year ago, inventorying all of that equipment. And that equipment, it could include things like the red dot sights on rifles that the department holds. We have had vehicles that we have received through the LISO program. At one point, we had a helicopter that was received through there. I believe we still have one. So all different types of equipment. And so what we are doing through our policy, and as you'll see there, policy 800.5, inventory control, we are addressing the need and would establish that list of these items that we obtain through this process, and that we would provide that inventory to the city manager. And then, as you see there, there's a process by which we would look for the city manager's office to give prior approval that any new type of equipment that we would seek to obtain prior to doing so. So that's how we're looking to address that policy recommendation. If you could move to the next slide, please. The third is the issue of the LRAD, which is the long-range acoustical device. This was a piece of equipment, I think, that was highlighted last summer during the protests and the riots that we used as a public announcing system. This is something we have had for several years. This piece of equipment also has the ability to be used as what's at times called a sonic weapon. It can produce either high-pitched, very loud sounds that basically deter anyone from wanting to be around it. That is not the purpose for which we've used this equipment in the past. We regularly use it as a PA system, most notably by the SWAT team when they are trying to get the attention of someone who may be inside a structure and barricaded. We use it as a PA system. So what you'll see here is the policy would forbid this from being used as a sonic weapon or a method of paying compliance, and that it would only be used as a public announcement system and to broadcast warnings or notifications or anything like that, and that it would only be done at a decibel level and a frequency that are safe for the purpose at that time. So we look to incorporate all of that in policy. Again, I just want to highlight that the LRAD's purpose in the time that we have had it has always been as a public address system. We're just formalizing a lot of this language in our policy. The next policy you will see is the policy around facial recognition software. And what council put forth in the resolution was the language stating that the use of facial recognition will not be used unless it is necessary due to an imminent threat or danger, must be approved by the city manager and ultimately reported to council if utilized. This is addressed in APD policy 100.5, which covers our hardware and software that we use at the department. And you'll see that we have specific language that would limit the use of facial recognition software, specifically that unless it was in furtherance of an active investigation of a violent felony or an active threat of a violence against the community, that we would not allow our employees to use the facial recognition technology, software, or services of another agency. So we are limiting this to the extent that we believe is appropriate, that we would only use it in those cases where it is a violent felony or an active threat of violence against our community. The only other exemption you will see there is obviously we have duties at the airport, and the federal government with TSA and other agencies has standing and control over many of the services out there. So if we were ever in conflict with that, then we have to apply by those federal rules and regulations in that circumstance. Outside of that, though, we would restrict in a way that I believe and we believe is consistent with council's direction, and that is it would only be used in the investigation of a violent felony or active threat against our community. And if we can go to the next slide, I'll go over the last two that are here. First of all is the no-knock search warrant. And what you see there is that the no-knock search warrant should be restricted and include comprehensive reporting to include the reasoning and the result. This is addressed in APD General Order 405, which is our fugitive and search warrants. And what you see there is the restrictions that we have in place on no-knock search warrants, that they will only be employed when officer safety is an issue. They will not be used just to prevent the destruction of evidence. So in other words, if it's a narcotic search warrant, And we believe that by announcing our presence and trying to obtain voluntary entry into the structure prior to a forceful entry, that there's a likelihood that the contraband would be destroyed or flushed or whatever, that is not a satisfactory reason to go with a no-knock search warrant, that it has to be something more than that. It has to be something that's bringing officer safety into play. And then you'll see some of the restrictions that it's going to require the approval at the commander level. It's not something that officers, sergeants, or lieutenants can sign off on and approve, but instead it would have to go to the commander level. And then, as you see, we would have a smart sheet that is able to track all of the no-knock search warrants. That way we would have the data on those search warrants and be able to provide reporting on those when appropriate if it didn't interfere with an ongoing or long-term investigation. So again, we think that we are appropriately approaching that policy in a way that allows us to still do our duties in a manner as safe as possible, and to restrict the use of these no-knock warrants to the greatest extent, using them only in those circumstances where we think it's the appropriate tactic based on the safety issues or the threat at hand. And then the last policy you'll see is addressing the use of tear gas. In the resolution, it wanted the stated policy of the city that the police use of tear gas is strictly prohibited. This is addressed in our general order, as you see, 20623, which is control devices. And where we are at on this is that we would not have an absolute restriction on the use of tear gas, but instead tear gas would only be used under the appropriate conditions as you see fit to, as you see on the slide, and that would be to prevent serious bodily injury or death. And there's a couple of examples of that, such as operations our SWAT team is regularly involved in, hostage rescues, barricaded subjects, officer rescues, things like that. And as you see on letter B there, only members of SWAT and SRT would be authorized. SWAT, this is a regular tactic employed by, I cannot sit here and tell you every SWAT team, but I would have a hard time thinking of SWAT teams that did not use a tear gas, a CS gas as an option. It allows you in many times to create an environment inside a structure that is either uninhabitable or one that individual no longer wants to inhabit. And hopefully you can get that person to exit the structure instead of sending officers into the structure. It is very dangerous when we send officers into a structure where a suspect has been, especially if they've been there for quite some time, as they may have had opportunities to target harden that location, to find places to hide and assault the officers upon entry. So this is a tactic that by inserting this into structures, you can oftentimes coerce and convince that person to come out of the residence. Now, this is something that is typically done well into a SWAT call after all other means have failed, negotiations, the attempt to get the person to answer the phone, all of that. This is another tactic that can be used. It's also an opportunity that if a subject's in a larger structure, that you can make areas of that structure locations where they do not want to enter, so that you can keep them from moving around freely in that structure and have a better chance of removing them from the structure, rescuing a hostage, downed officer, whatever that may be. SRT is our special response team, and this is the group that works with crowd control. And what we are saying is that we would reserve the right for use by SRT for those circumstances where it was necessary due to there being large-scale property destruction, vandalism, large-scale looting, arson, things like that, that we cannot get a handle on other ways, but that it would be restricted for use against individuals that are solely exercising First Amendment rights to speech or to assemble or to protest. So we think that we're putting the appropriate parameters on the use of tear gas and limiting it to those circumstances where it will allow officers to approach these types of dangerous situations in the safest manner possible and in a manner that does not really pose a threat of bodily injury to an individual. Instead, it's something that's very discomforting to most, and it makes them want to get away from the location where that chemical has been dispersed. So I know that Farrah Muscadin, OPO, has got a presentation that she will be having here in a moment, where she's going to go over their recommendations on these same 6 issues. And so I want to leave it up to, I guess I don't know if you want to talk about our proposals, or if you want to hear from OPO first and then enter into either a discussion or a question and answer. And as you can see, I've got Troy Gay, our Chief of Staff, on the call, as well as Joe Chacon, who is third in command of the department, so that with my imminent departure here in the coming weeks, these 2 leaders will be on hand for quite some time as we continue to work through the implementation of these policy changes. So you have all 3 of us here to hopefully be able to answer any questions you may have.
Yeah, thank you, Chief Manley, and thank you all for being here and really giving this presentation. So I want to make sure that I have the right context and understanding for these policies. These are things that are not currently active policy. Is that correct? They are still in the recommendation stage, or these are things that have already been implemented?
Some of these reflect our current practices, and some of them will be new language to policy.
Gotcha. Thank you for that. And then I have a quick question on the no-knock reporting and what that looks like. I would love to know if you can share some of the criteria that you all are gathering, and then where is that reported to? Are there other city offices that are receiving that information on an annual or other kind of time structured basis, or is that something that's strictly internal within the department?
Certainly. So that is an internal reporting system that we have and that we keep track of. It's not something that we are reporting out on that I'm aware of at this time. I'm going to ask Chief Chacon if he wants to weigh in. He oversees one of his areas of responsibility is our tactical units, the SWAT team being the one that most frequently uses this tool.
Good evening. My name is Joe Chacon. I'm one of the assistant chiefs for APD. For those that I haven't met before, with regard to the no-knock warrants, first of all, I'll just tell you they're pretty rare for us to execute. I don't have the exact number, but I can tell you that the vast majority of warrants that we execute are your more typical search warrants. And what we've done is put in an internal reporting mechanism that allows us through, per the kind of mandates of the resolution, to make sure that we're keeping track of the dates, the locations, the relevant case number, what the authority was that went ahead and approved the warrant, because it has to be done at the commander level or above, and it also has to go before those judges that typically are typically not. Typically those depends on the kind of case, but some of them you have to go to district court judges or even federal judges to be able to get those kind of warrants approved. So there's a number of, we put in a number of layers of approval process to make sure that we're taking really good hard look at these, to make sure that there is ample justification for approving these kind of warrants, because we all understand the dangers that can be involved with them. They are not reported outside of our department. That's internal, and at the request of city management, or as the need might arise, we would then report that out as needed.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I will open it up to other commissioners if you have questions before we move to the OPO presentation. Go ahead.
Right. So the resolution has a reduction in military grade equipment, but from what I think I heard, you proposed prior approval to future purchases. Am I correct in that? If I'm not, what are you proposing to reduce from that stockpile?
So it's not necessarily a stockpile. We have equipment that we have obtained and issued to officers. So we have done a full accounting of what that equipment is. And I'll ask either Joe or Troy to weigh in on anything that was sent back. Some of it is consumables, and so therefore we don't have those items anymore. And then the agreement as we go forward would be if we were to seek the acquisition of any of this type of equipment that is outside of a normal acquisition. In other words, we've gotten goggles from them before so that officers can wear them in certain situations. And so if that was something that we have routinely gotten through a military surplus program and we needed more, then we would not seek to get approval to do that again, versus if we were in the future, and I will say this as an example, knowing that this is not something we're looking to do, but if we were wanting to get an MRAP, one of those large military style anti-mine vehicles that you see being used all the time, and many police departments have acquired those, then that is something that is outside of a normal request we have ever had or a piece of equipment we've ever had. That's the one where we would seek approval.
And Chief, I'll just go ahead and add on to kind of elaborate a little bit more on the answer. All the equipment has to be very carefully cataloged. We have to keep up with it because we have to report back to the federal government on the equipment to make sure that we are that we're keeping track of it, that it's properly assigned, and that if necessary, we would be able to collect it back up again. A lot of, the chief went over some of the types of things that we've gotten, such as, some of the bigger items. We got a helicopter, we've gotten vehicles, and we've gotten scopes for rifles and things like that. But we've also gotten kind of more run-of-the-mill items such as flashlights, goggles, storage containers that can be used, and those type of things. When we went through the audit recently, we discovered, well, not discovered, but we really cataloged all the items that were either we no longer needed, and there were many, or that had been, that basically had reached end of life because they were just no longer serviceable. And we're in the process. I've got to check with my commander, but we are collecting all of that. And what we were waiting for was the go-ahead from the federal government to deliver it back to them, because we have to turn it back in. We were supposed to do that last year, but COVID prevented us from doing it, and they were not allowing us to go onto the military base in San Antonio to go ahead and return it. I think those restrictions have eased somewhat, and so it's just a matter of, and that is what that part of the compliance for that part of the resolution, to go ahead and get rid of the stuff or take it out of our inventory if it's not approved or it's no longer being used. There is a standing list of things that we have indicated to city management that we have an ongoing need for, and that if we see it appear in the LISO portal, that we would be asking for it. But anything that is not on that list, we have to request specific permission from city management to be able to put in for that. And of course, the city manager would communicate with council on those items.
I have a follow-up question. So a lot of this equipment is acquired through purchases, is that right?
No, that's not correct. The LISO program it's basically lent to us by the federal government.
Okay. So I have another question, if you will. To your recollection, I'm thinking to the use of force reports that we've seen and deaths involving police officers. I don't recall ever seeing an officer involved death involving a chokehold in Austin. Can you tell me how often a chokehold has been used to end a person's life by APD?
I'm not aware of a chokehold being used in a critical incident in my time at the department. I do remember very, very early on which would have been back in the very earliest of the 90s. I believe there was a struggle on a waterbed with a suspect that resulted in a fatality, but it was not the result of a chokehold from what I remember of that incident. And again, that's 27 years ago. I am not aware of any incident since then that comes to mind, and got a lot of experience with the other two on the call here. I'll ask them to weigh in if they recall any, but I do not.
No, sir, I'm not aware of any.
Same here. I am unaware as well.
Okay, so outside of the equipment that you have on your belt, essentially, there haven't been deaths outside of using those? Just want to be sure. I think I heard you mention, Chief Manley, that officers were allowed to use anything at their disposal. I think you mentioned including a brick if they needed to. So I just want to be sure that from when I'm hearing that only the tools at your disposal on your bodies have been used.
To my knowledge, or the tools that may be in the car, such as a shotgun or a rifle. But then other than that, the equipment that the officers wear on their duty belt, I believe that's a fair statement to my knowledge, yes.
Okay. And I have one last question involving the CS gas. So I understand that you would use those in hostage rescue, barricaded subjects, and officer rescue. Have you spoken to anyone who's been subject to CS gas exposure afterwards and asked them about any long-term effects of use of CS gas, whether it's an officer or a hostage? And I just understand that usually hostage situations involve family members, women and children. I'm just wondering if you have any knowledge of after effects of use of CS gas.
I've not spoken to anyone afterwards. Having gone through the SWAT school myself, one of the sessions in that training is an exposure session to where we all go into a confined room, initially with the gas mask on, and they deploy canisters of CS gas in the room with us. Number one, it gives the officers confidence that the gas masks will work. And then the second part of the exercise is you take off your mask and you stay in that environment so that you understand the impacts of that. So I myself have been exposed and know what it does to an individual, and the fact that the impacts are short-lived, and that once you get out of that environment and you have an opportunity to get that off of your person, whether it be your eyes or your skin, that the symptoms will soon dissipate with no long-term effects.
How long is y'all's exposure to the CS gas in your training?
I went through this as a lieutenant, and we were in that room for, I don't know, several minutes. We were in that room with that gas. Ultimately, they don't lock the door and make you stay in there. You stay in the room until you can no longer stay in the room, and then you exit.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner McMahon. Other questions? Commissioner Connolly, go ahead.
Yeah, so actually, I think Commissioner McMahon already touched on the main question that I had, which was CS gas. But I mean, it seems to me across a lot of these recommendations, it seems that the council resolution language conveys a certain tone of urgency in terms of the need for change, and that the recommendations that are being put forward essentially keep things pretty much the way they already are. So I'm interested in that kind of the gap I see between the urgency in the council recommendations, and then the fact that we have a set the council resolution, and then we have a set of recommendations that essentially sort of seem to preserve the status quo on almost all of these items. But I think the CS gas one really stands out. So it says on item A, it says unless in cases of extreme civil unrest, although in item D, it does say that it should not be used against people exercising their First Amendment right to assemble and protest. And I'm curious, I'd like to ask Chief Manley, and I'd like to ask the other officers who are here, would you classify the protests that took place over the last summer in response to George Floyd's death and Mike Ramos's death, if you would classify those as incidents of folks exercising their First Amendment rights, or were those cases of extreme civil unrest? Because hundreds of members of the city called into council telling their firsthand accounts of how they had been tear gassed, and it was extremely, I think, traumatic for the community as a whole. But I'm curious if that was civil unrest or if that was First Amendment rights.
Throughout that first weekend, there were periods of both. There were periods where we had individuals out there that were exercising their First Amendment rights to free speech and to assemble and to protest, and were trying to do it peacefully. And then there were moments where people's actions turned that into a riot and turned that into situations where there was significant civil unrest. What we're looking at is, thankfully, we didn't have this here, but what we saw, unfortunately, playing out in cities across our country as we all paid attention, is cities where there was a significant amount of arson and looting and things like that by these large groups. And so that is similar to what we're trying to address. You know, thankfully, we did not see that here. We did have an act of arson that did take place when someone in the crowd set a car on fire under the bridge, and then ultimately drug all the possessions of one of our people that was experiencing homelessness and living under the bridge there, drug their personal property into that fire. And then we know we came across some individuals with Molotov cocktails, but thankfully we didn't see some of what was happening in some of the other cities. So the shortest answer to your question, though, would be that we had periods of both.
Well, I'm glad to hear APD protecting the property of unhoused individuals. That's comforting. But at the same time, I'm curious. This is largely up to the discretion of a commander or assistant chief, which seems to be the case over the past summer. I think the substance of my question is, what really changes with regards to the way we handled this last summer and how we will handle this now with these recommendations?
Can you all still hear me? I no longer have visual on my computer. Can you all still hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'll answer, and then I might have to back out and try and get back in because I've lost everything. But what changes here, I think, is we are explicitly stating that this is not going to be used in circumstances where it is just a First Amendment protected activity. And then we are further delineating those circumstances in tactical situations where its use would both be appropriate and allowed.
But ultimately, that still falls to the discretion of the commander. Is that correct?
Yes. I mean, obviously, they're the ones that are out there, and they're the ones that are going to be making that judgment on the scene.
Okay, thank you. I don't have any more questions. Thank you.
I have a quick follow-up question to that relating to the judgment and what that looks like. Is there a standardized process or training for how to assess situations where you're dealing with large crowds and populations that could potentially end up in civil unrest? Or is there a rubric or framework that you all follow in kind of analyzing as you're looking at, you know, both resources and response and level of response to those situations?
I'm going to take a moment to try and fix my computer here, but actually Chief Chacon is the perfect person for that question anyway, as he oversees these teams. So you're going to see me disappear and hopefully reappear back on screen in a moment. And I'm going to ask Chief Chacon if you will address that.
Sounds
Certainly.
good.
So for the Austin Police Department, that is the mobile field force training. To answer the question, yes, there is training that we put all of our officers through. It begins in the police academy, and then throughout, what has largely been driven throughout the years is that the special response team has been the one to be activated when we have known large mass gatherings that could turn that could turn very quickly into groups that are fighting with one another or fighting against the police. We will go ahead and activate special response and have them come out and basically stand ready to do that. We also have our bicycle public order team, which has been very effective over the last several years because we have groups that will assemble at at the state capitol particularly. And as we saw over the summer, when the state capitol grounds were actually closed, those were pushed out onto the city streets. And over the years, really, we've had people that might be on opposite sides of a particular issue or topic that are kind of face to face, and we'll use our bicycle public order team to keep them separate, allow them to voice opinions, but make sure that it remains peaceful and that nobody gets hurt. And it's been very, very successful. You know, we typically do not make arrests. We don't have to use any kind of force, and people abide by the officers, the officers' instructions. What we saw over the summer was not that. As officers would give instructions, they were not obeyed, and as the chief mentioned, many times it devolved into riots. So the officers, we had to bring out a greater number of officers outside of our special response team, bring in patrol and others that had been trained in the mobile field force training to go ahead and employ that training as they were able to.
And I have a quick question around this mobile field force training. About how many hours is that training, and like how ongoing maybe, is there any like annual, I don't know, annual just like reinforcement or, follow-up trainings that happen? What does that look like?
Yeah. So for our special response team, we have biannual refreshers that they are going twice a year to go through. For all of the just normal patrol officers, once they had received it, we were not providing all of the officers regular refreshers. That is a deficiency that we saw coming out of this last summer's activities, and something that is going to be remedied with regular refreshers that I have my SRT planning for, that we will roll out on an annual basis for all of our patrol folks particularly. But yes, and as far as the actual number of hours, I'd have to get that for you. I'm not sure like how many hours the initial course is and the refresher is, and those type of things.
Thank you.
Amani, do you mind if I jump in here with a follow-up question it's on topic, just real quick. Do you think that training as it currently is actually allows officers to properly gauge the nature of a situation? And if so, do you think that the officers did a good job gauging the nature of the situation this past summer?
I think that if it will always be driven by how effective, because remember, if we're talking about mobile field force, that is officers getting in front of individuals or large groups of individuals and attempting to either control them by pushing them back, or holding the line wherever they are as they try to advance. And if you have an insufficient number of officers compared to the size of the crowd, it can become ineffective. And that was the case in many, many instances this past year during the protests. And we saw that the officers were quickly overrun by the size of the crowd and the aggressiveness of the crowd. I think that like I said, in most typical situations where we're using our training, it has been very effective, because people generally are not out to commit violence and commit crimes. They're there to exercise their First Amendment rights. And our first objective is to make sure that they're able to do that safely. And so, 90+% of the time, when we are doing that, whether it's at the state capitol or somewhere else, we can do it without having to make arrests, without having to use any kind of force on anyone. But as I said, the protests that occurred over this past summer were very different in nature. And the officers, despite many times their best efforts to engage in communication with the folks that were out there, just didn't have the opportunity, because it devolved into riots, and they had things that were being thrown at them. And we had, we had officers injured. So I think that in most cases it can be effective. We have supervision that's out there that's assessing the crowds and is making sure that we aren't putting our officers in harm's way. But those situations were so dynamic and many times changed so quickly that that we saw that, for instance, our officers were overrun and we had to pull them back.
If the situations are dynamic and change so rapidly, wouldn't that in and of itself be a good argument to not use CS gas, which could potentially have very harmful effects on the lives of civilians standing around? If the situation is evolving so rapidly as to not allow the officer to properly gauge the nature of the situation, wouldn't that be a good argument to completely refrain from the use of CS gas?
I think what you're seeing is policy that's going to limit it very, very strictly. This is not something that would be done on a whim or by that frontline officer. It's going to require approval by that commander who is going to have situational awareness. So if it were to be used in a circumstance like that, it would be because this has been something that's been going on prolonged and not something that's dynamic as far as it might change in a minute. That's why we've written the language that we have.
Thank you.
Because of our time, I want to thank you all for coming and answering our questions. And commissioners, if we have follow-up questions, we will definitely send them